So, Tim, you recently also mentioned while you were in Kiev the idea of the Ukraine, let's say, having its own version of Russian, or even having an institute which codified the language. So, why do you think it matters, and how how did you come up with this idea?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to be clear about what I think about the Ukrainian language before we talk about Russian. I think I'm in favor of Ukrainization. I think Ukraine should have a language of high culture and politics, and that language should be Ukrainian. If it were up to me, Ukrainian diplomats would speak Ukrainian to each other in private and not Russian. If it were up to me, Ukrainian school teachers would speak Ukrainian between the classes and not Russian. If it were up to me, Ukrainian politicians would speak Ukrainian to each other. If it were up to me, the new Ukrainian president would speak Ukrainian when he met with Ukrainian businessmen. If it were up to me, there would be more Ukrainian in Ukrainian public life. I'm in favor of Ukrainization. But it's, I think, very important when you do have an important second language in your country to realize that you're not alone, to realize that this second language, because the world is the way that it is, has to be made your own. So the situation that Ukraine has is actually very unusual. It's not normal to have an important second language in your country and not standardize it. It's not normal to have an important second language in your country and let another country basically tell you what to do with it. So the international norm is, if you have a language, you write your own dictionaries, you write your own school textbooks, you choose spelling rules that are your own, you choose grammar that's your own. The language that I'm speaking is American English. I can immediately, at a glance, tell whether a text is in British English or American English. And that's the way I think it should be. That way is normal. So what I am proposing is actually not some strange idea. What I'm proposing is the way the rest of the world actually does things. But to put it a different way, Ukraine is giving Russia a completely unnatural advantage by not standardizing the Russian language. It's just, what it means is that Ukrainians can't tell whether Russian is coming from Russia or whether it's coming from Ukraine. If you had your own version of the language with your own dictionaries and so on, then you could have rules that would allow people to tell whether a newspaper was from Russia or whether it was from Ukraine. And also, it would allow Ukrainians to express themselves in Russian in a way that was nevertheless not exactly the same way as people speak in the Russian Federation. So you would allow Ukrainian journalists, Ukrainian students who are writing their papers, to write in a way that's Ukrainian. Again, so look, I'm an American, I'm from a big important country, but I grew up with a certain version of my language. I grew up learning to put commas in a certain place, and I learned that a truck is a truck and not a lorry. And then when I went to England, there were a whole lot of things which were different. That's normal. That's the way that it should be. And this means that England can protect itself a bit from America, and America can protect itself a bit from England, because you can always tell where something is coming from. So you ask, when I had this idea, I've had this idea for years and years. I mean, I was actually talking about it in 2014 when I organized a conference during or right after the Maidan. And the reason why it's important for me is not because the Russian language is important for me. The reason why it's important for me is because Ukraine is important for me. It's important for me that Ukraine has institutions that allow language and culture and so on to develop normally. But then there's one other aspect of this which is worth mentioning, and that is that it's an offensive weapon. I mean, it's not just defense. If you standardize the Russian language inside Ukraine, you're defending yourself against Russia. But you're also creating the possibility for offensive political work against Russia. Right now the Russians tell everyone who will listen that Ukraine is a terribly oppressive country. If you had officially your own Ukrainian version of the Russian language, that would be a very powerful argument against that Russian propaganda. You could say, no, actually, we are supporting the Russian language. And you can make the following point, which is true. You could say, in Russia, there's no freedom of speech, which means someone else has to take care of the Russian language. So we have freedom of speech, therefore we're going to take care of the Russian language, which would not only be true, but it would be an excellent point to make for Westerners who don't quite know how to understand the situation in Ukraine. So, I mean, if there were going to be such an institute, for me it would have three parts. The first part would be you standardize the language, you print dictionaries, you create school books. The second part would be you give refuge to writers who come from Russian-speaking parts of the world, whether it's Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or Russia itself or whatever. And the third is you have reporting about Russia. So I see this also as a way for Ukraine to turn the tables. I mean, the fact that you have the Russian language inside Ukraine is an advantage rather than a disadvantage. And it just, up to now, it hasn't been exploited.
Since what we talk definitely would be, in particular among our audience, that is the interest, but probably you understand what a discussion these ideas might have in Ukraine, because we do have a number of the, let's say, fighters for the right of the Ukrainian language, and they're very concerned that still the Russian language had such a powerful position in Ukraine that any time you would like to promote it, that might be the danger for the Ukrainian, which is still in this very weak position because it's not really spoken by most of the Ukrainians, even not by even the majority. If you really look, that like today still the printed press, not television, but printed press is published in Russian. So there is this feeling of the threat that if you give them this, that could be used in order that, like, I don't need Ukrainian. That is usual argument in this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, so I have to say I'm sympathetic to that. I think that Ukrainization should continue, and I think, I mean, look, I have only ever spoken Ukrainian in Ukraine, which is a totally artificial position. I know no Ukrainian who can say that, but although I understand Russian and I spend a lot of time reading Russian, I only speak Ukrainian in Ukraine. And so that means that I've noticed how things have changed over the last 25 years. And how people react to foreigners speaking Ukrainian has changed quite a lot. And from my point of view, in a good direction. And I think in the next 25 years, things should continue in that direction. And I'm very sympathetic to people who say our language is threatened by globalization, or our language is threatened by a powerful neighbor. Right? I'm sympathetic to people who speak French in Canada, who are surrounded not just by Canada, but by the United States of America. And I'm glad that French has survived in Canada. I'm glad French is doing well in Canada. But I don't see this at all as a competition between Ukrainian and Russian. On the contrary, I think if there's going to be so much use of Russian, it makes sense to make it your own Russian. Because you're going to be speaking it for the next several decades. So I remember in the 1990s, late 1990s, I was at Harvard, and a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard, Hromadske, said in a seminar, Russia is going to be a natural language in Ukraine for the next several decades. And it surprised me that he said that, because Professor Sporluk is actually from Poland. He's from the far west of the Ukrainian-speaking language area. Russian is not, he had to learn Russian, and his Russian is actually not he doesn't speak Russian very well. So I was surprised to hear that, but I realized, yes, that's true, and I think it's still true. I think Russian is going to be a natural language in Ukraine for some time, and so the question is, what do you do with it? Are you just ashamed about it? Because the problem of the current situation is that lots of people speak Russian, and then they're influenced by the Russian internet. And lots of people speak Russian, and then they're influenced, whether they realize it or not, by things that come from the rest of the world. I think it would be better if there was a Ukrainian version of Russian where you could tell, oh, this internet page is written by Ukrainians because they're observing these language rules. Or this book was clearly published in Ukraine because look, it's in Russian, but it's following these language rules and not other language rules. So, but there's no competition. I mean, if there was like, I think of it in my own mind as an Ukraiński Державний Інститут Російської мови та культури. If there was such a thing, we're talking about something which would cost a few million euros a year. I mean, we're talking about a building or 2 buildings, 3 buildings maybe. We're not talking about competing on the whole area of the country. We're talking about doing a very technical operation, which is standardizing a language that millions of people use. I don't think it's in competition with Ukrainian at all. I mean, of course, I should say, like, this is for Ukrainians to decide. I'm not trying to tell Ukrainians what to do. But I just do think there's something very strange about tens of millions of people using a language which their state does not standardize. I think that I'm not just saying that, that's a very unusual situation. You won't find that in Switzerland or Quebec or anywhere else.
So just to remind, is it, we start with that, but still maybe you go globally with that. So what are other situations like that? You mean like Switzerland or Brazil, or which speaks Portuguese, or like, would you give an example? So what makes really Russian so unique, or maybe Chinese is Chinese?
Yeah, well, it's not actually. In Taiwan, it's different.
Okay, so you give us, give us a knowledge, yeah.
You see, no, your situation seems normal to you, but your situation is actually exceptional. So when the United States became an independent country, it wasn't clear what language people were going to speak. There were still a lot of German speakers, and speakers of lots of other languages. And eventually English won out. But what English won out, right? The English that Americans standardized themselves. One of the very first things that Americans did was write dictionaries, which might seem very strange, but the whole point was to show that you were a different country from England, and so you had to have a different English. Likewise, Quebec is different from Canada, and it's different from the United States. They speak French, but Quebecois is a different French than the French that's spoken in France. And it's codified differently. I mean, it's not just that people speak it differently, it's that there are different official uses. And that if you learn the French language in Canada, you'll be using books that teach you a few different things than if you learn the French language in France. And yeah, you mentioned Brazil, it's the same in Brazil. Brazilian Portuguese is different. Spanish is spoken all around the world, but there is not a single Spanish-speaking country which lets Spain tell them how to speak Spanish. Not one. They all do it their own way, right? So you're in a weird situation because you're basically allowing Russians to tell you how to speak Russian, or how to read Russian, or how to write Russian. That's not normal.
There would be still people who claim that bilingualism in Ukraine maybe isn't really the way, because look, for instance, at Estonians or Georgians. Mm-hmm. In the end, finally, they have the generation which doesn't know Russian, and the country lives with that. Mm-hmm. And this argument, we can discuss whether the bilingualism is a good thing. I have opinion on that, of course, but generally how you would argue with that, or would give this example of. Because still some people say like that the language helps to build the country, or is it an outdated concept?
So, I'm going to answer that at a slightly different level. I spend enough time in Ukraine, and I've spent enough time in Ukraine to have a fairly realistic notion of what languages people actually speak, right? I have a fairly realistic notion of what people speak in the subway in Kiev. I have not to mention how people speak on the street in Dnipro or Kharkiv. I have a fairly realistic notion not only of how many people speak Russian, but of when and in what circumstances Ukrainian speakers switch to Russian. The last time I was at the cafe where we were sitting right now, at the table right over there were 2 young Ukrainian women, and they were speaking Ukrainian and switching back and forth to Russian, right, in a very characteristic way. So what I think is, it would be better in Ukraine if there was a little bit less mixing around, a little bit more clarity about when one is speaking Ukrainian and when one is speaking Russian, And I think it would help if Russian was, as it were, owned by Ukraine. Like because there's this element of shame about it, right? Like everybody claims, not everybody, but I would say most people claim in public, not most people, a lot of people claim in public that they speak more Ukrainian than they actually do, right?
Yeah, because that could be, today accepting that it's not would give an argument that probably there are more Russian speakers in Ukraine than people think.
Yeah, okay, but now moving on to your question, like this whole category of Ukrainian speaker and Russian speaker, it means nothing to me. I mean, for me, I'm not just speaking about Ukraine, I'm talking about the history of the nation. In the history of the nation, it's not language is an aspiration, right? So the people who created the Czech nation were German speakers. The people who created the Ukrainian nation in the 19th century, Hromadske, what were Hromadske's parents' languages? Russian and Polish. The language is a political aspiration. You say part of creating this nation is that we're going to have a language, but it's not a reality. It's not that people speak a language and therefore they create a nation. It's part of what you create. So, the people who created the Slovak nation, they spoke Hungarian and German, and even the Poles, they had to work really hard to turn German and High German, High Russian into a Polish vocabulary. It's true pretty much everybody. You have to create the language along with everything else. That's normal, right? And the best patriots are not necessarily the people who speak the language of the nation. People who speak the language of the nation can also be scoundrels, just like anybody else. And the best patriots can be people who don't speak that language or speak other language better. That's actually historically normal. So, pretty much every East European nation was created by people who spoke a bunch of languages, not by people who spoke one language. So the Ukrainian situation is actually normal. It's totally normal. It's normal that you have Russian speakers who are patriots. It's normal you have Ukrainian speakers who are patriots. It's normal you have people who speak 2 languages or 3 languages who are patriots. That's totally normal. I don't have any, historically speaking, there's nothing to be said against that. What I just think, I'm in favor of Ukrainization in the sense I think that the public language should be a little bit clearer. And I think part of making the public language clearer is being clear about what Russian is. Russian's a language, this is how we speak it, this is how we write it, we don't always switch back and forth, we don't,
It's not the language they speak in Russia.
Right. Russian is ours. Russian is something Ukrainians own, but they don't admit that they own it. And that's a very awkward situation, and it gives Russia huge amounts of power that it shouldn't have, basically. If Ukrainians would say, okay, Ukrainian is the most important language, it's the main language, we're going to keep Ukrainizing, children are going to speak Ukrainian in school, that's all good, but we also own Russian, and we write books in Russian, and we can say what we think in Russian. I think that's an argument that should be made over and over and over again, that if you want to say what you want in Russian, you have to go to Ukraine. You can't do it in Belarus, you can't do it in Kazakhstan, you can't do it in Russia. If you want to say what you want in Russian, you have to go to Brooklyn, or you have to go to Israel, or you have to go to Ukraine, right? In Ukraine is the largest country in the world, and probably the largest country, now that I think about it, in the history of the world, where people can say what they want in Russian. That's not a normal situation, right? So I think Ukrainians would do a lot of good for themselves by saying, we own this language. This language belongs to us, not only to us, but it doesn't just belong to our northern neighbor. It belongs to us as well.
So, since you were thinking about that, how would you also see the Ukrainization? I know this is a particular idea about the Russian language, but now we have different kind of the discussion, what that should be like, quotas, different kind of the support. I won't say that there is one way to do that, or there is one civilized way to do that. Still, there is a discussion, for instance, that was interesting when current President Zelenskyy mentioned that, I'm not in favor of the quotas, I'm in favor of the, having, for instance, lower taxes on the things which created in Ukrainian. I don't know, the publishers or the filmmakers who do the things in Ukrainians would pay less taxes or things like that, instead of kind of putting this television idea that we should have 10%, not more than 10% of the content in Russian. So maybe looking at the other countries, I know you're a historian, but still getting, if you're already considering these ideas about the language, what are the language support in the 21st century? You know, it's not just creating a books and making it in the manual and creating a school.
Yeah.
How you do it in a globalized world in 21st century?
Yeah, I think the higher the technology, the more the state has to intervene. So, if you wanted to standardize a language in the 19th century, all you had to do was write the dictionary. I mean, I keep talking about dictionaries, but there's a reason for that, which is that everybody in the 19th century who created languages, including the Ukrainians, they wrote dictionaries. That's what you had to do. Dictionaries, encyclopedias, reference books. Come to a consensus about what your own language looks like. But you're right, with television it's much more confusing because television moves around. So, you know, you can go, when I go on Ukrainian television, okay, the last time I was on Ukrainian television, I was doing an interview with a Russian who works in Ukraine, and he was asking me questions in Russian and I was answering them in Ukrainian. And then when I'm on these late night talk shows in Ukraine, like some people generally speak Ukrainian, but somebody might speak Russian. What do you do about that? Do you ban it? No, I don't think so. But I do think you have to have rules with television. And the reason why I think you have to have rules with television is because there are bigger countries with much more mature industries who otherwise wipe you out. So I'm actually, when I lived in France, I was very sympathetic to the French and their quota system and trying to keep American culture out. Not because I hated Hollywood the way that French intellectuals do. I don't hate Hollywood the way French intellectuals do. But I was sympathetic to the fact that they were at a kind of economic disadvantage, right? Like we could just produce like thing after thing after thing after thing for a world market, which they couldn't do. And Ukraine is in that same situation vis-a-vis Russia. Ukraine just can't, you know, there's decades of Russian television material already available. You can't produce as much or as quickly as they can produce it. You're at a technical disadvantage. So I'm actually in favor of the state intervening and setting up clear rules. And then with the internet, I think you have to be even more careful. Because people spend, I don't know, Americans spend about 10 hours a day in front of screens, and I'm not sure Ukrainians are any better than we are.
It's still a bit bigger,
Yeah.
like average than in Europeans.
Yeah. I think with the internet, one has to be very careful. Like, not that, it's very hard to control the whole internet, but you can make rules about, the front pages of browsers and so on. Like, the interface, as much of the interface as possible is in Ukrainian if it's going to be in Ukraine before you move into other stuff. So no, for me, like the higher tech it is, the more I am sympathetic to the attempt of the state. And I think I probably disagree with President Zelenskyy about this. He said even if there weren't quotas, he would have shifted over to Ukrainian. I don't know, maybe. I'm not so sure. I think if you, in order to get, and I think it's important that people like him shifted over to Ukrainian in public. But I think in order to get there have to be both financial incentives, as he says, but also there have to be certain rules.
You've been for so many years explaining Ukraine to the Western world, and one of the part you were explaining, of course, the Ukrainian past and the whole kind of Russian propaganda thing about the Ukrainian nationalism and fascism and all the things. So having the Russian-speaking president today, who tries to speak Ukrainian in official ways, but sometimes he switches on to Russian. Because, of course, anything he speaks is a public, anything the president says in all the circumstances, is it formal, informal, is it in a gym or elsewhere, is considered to be public for a president. Right. And I've heard quite a criticism that, look, he shouldn't do that. He should be very strict. At the same time, there is a message to somebody would say but that's the message. That's the way he can find the way to the others, for instance. Were you also thinking this bilingualism in the public life can be as well. Because of course it's symbolic, and of course it's good that some of the, we had this famous Prime Minister Azarov who tried to speak Ukrainian, and everybody laughs at him, but he tried.
Mr. Zelenskyy is a very smart person. He's going to figure these things out for himself, and I'm not here to dictate what Ukrainian political style should be. But I think there are different ways of being bilingual. So, for example, if you think about late April and the exchange with Mr. Putin about passports, so in that case, Mr. Zelenskyy delivered a very powerful statement in Ukrainian. I can't really judge, but as far as I could tell, in perfect Ukrainian. And then he delivered the same statement in Russian. And it was very serious both times. So he didn't, it was all very straight, it was all very ceremonial. That's one thing, and I actually think that was very smart, because that's the use of, for me, that's the use of Russian also as an offensive weapon, right? You're saying something in Russian because you're trying to get the other side. You're trying to reach into their conversation. When I read his interviews in Brussels, or when I read him, he's in foreign countries and he's being interviewed by Ukrainian journalists, and he's trying to think of how he feels about Juncker, for example, and he uses the word muzhik, like he switches over to Russian. I have to say, I think that's something different, right? I'm personally, again, I'm not his voter and I'm not a Ukrainian. Personally, I'm less comfortable with that. I think as the president of Ukraine, he should be able to express whatever thought he's expressing to a Ukrainian journalist in Ukrainian. I'd rather he not go all Sergic every time he's trying to. And then the danger is that he does it. A few times I've seen him do it. He does it when he's trying to say something which is nice or which is clever. It's almost like the dearest things then come out in Russian. That makes me a little bit uncomfortable, like that version of bilingualism. I think he should try to stay in Ukrainian. I think he should try to stay in Ukrainian when he's speaking Ukrainian, and then when he's speaking Russian, do it for some clear political purpose, usually having to do with the Russian Federation. But again, he's his own person. He has his own style. He's going to do what he wants to do. But that's how I reacted to it.
One of the ideas as well, what is quite discussed by the particular administration, is to create a Russian language media for the occupied territories and Crimea.
Yeah.
And somehow it's interesting because what I remember that after the Russian-Ukrainian war started, in particular in the Baltic states, there was so much discussion about creating a medium in Russian, and especially in Latvia, where there are so many Russian speakers. And in the end, it had happened that it was such a kind of obvious idea that we needed to do something, but the Latvian parliament really didn't support it, because they say that it would give them still more power and more space to speak. We are small. So the fact that it's said and there is this ambition doesn't mean that it would happen, or because creating another channel in our time, it's quite a huge task. But to what extent do you find it significant?
I think you should create Russian language media for Russia, which would only secondarily be for the Donbass and Crimea. I think you should create Russian language media for Russia, and you should try to get other people to help you pay for it. So I think you should be much more ambitious. I think it's not. You shouldn't just be breaking the power of Russian language media in Ukraine. You should be creating, and by the way, not propagandistic, but I think you should actually create good television journalism for the Russian Federation, and secondarily for Crimea and for the Donbass. Because if you could do something in Russian like that, which people trusted, that would be good. It'd be good to have more journalism that's in Russian, but that could really affect. That could help the population of the Russian Federation, right? Why? You're in a much better position to be Radio Free Europe than Radio Free Europe is, because Radio Free Europe is owned by the Americans and blah blah blah. But you actually understand that world much better than other people do. So why not have Russian language media, which is basically for the Russian Federation? Canada should do the same thing. They should create English language news and beam it to America. It would be very helpful.
So since we already get into that, because like the whole idea of this talk is about the language and the institute, and that was our like idea to make this talk and devote it to that. Still, you coming back in Ukraine, that would be strange if I won't ask you that. Your recent books you were writing so much about more politics. It wasn't that much about history and the modern world, in particular, the authoritarian growth globally and in the US, and of course populism. So obviously many Ukrainians with the elections, with what had happened, were also looking at the phenomenon of Zelenskyy victory as something which comes together with all this global phenomenon. Trump, social media, populism, a celebrity president, anti-establishment. How do you see that? Because you were speaking about liberalism, populism, all these terms. And all those terms are very often used describing current Ukrainian political change. What is there for you? What do you see there? Liberal, illiberal, populistic, non-populistic? And how do you see the whole phenomenon of Zelenskyy in this thing?
There's one very general trend, which is the trend of artists in politics, for lack of a better term. So like Mr. Trump is thought by lots of people to be a successful businessman, but he's not. He is someone who played a successful businessman on television. And in that way, he's actually very similar to Mr. Zelenskyy. So Mr. Trump never played the president on television, but he played a powerful person he played a powerful, successful person on television. And it's that made him possible as a politician. So not anything he did in the real world, because in the real world he's bankrupted his companies and lost lots of money and has hundreds of millions of dollars of debt. But on television he was successful. So when naturally looking at Mr. Zelenskyy from an American point of view, there's this concern like, oh, okay, so here we have another television character. That's not the same thing as populism, though. That's more a statement about the media, right? That we've reached a certain extreme where people can become president of their countries without actually entering politics at all, except to run a presidential campaign. And even during the presidential campaign, and again, this is a similarity, you don't say very much about what your policies actually will be. You as it were, you stay in character, like you're a character running for president. Now, that doesn't have to end badly, though. I mean, I would say in the United States it's ended very badly, because Mr. Trump is a very selfish man and has no other talents besides the talent of persuading people he has talent. But that may not be true of Mr. Zelenskyy. Mr. Zelenskyy has already said more interesting things about policy in the first few weeks in office than Mr. Trump has ever said. And Mr. Zelenskyy has, unlike Mr. Trump, taken positions on things now that he's president. So positions that might be unexpected, which Mr. Trump never does. He doesn't take positions, but when he does, they're exactly the positions you would expect him.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's all that. So in the case of Mr. Trump, you thought Mr. Trump would want to be Mr. Putin's best friend.
Oh yeah.
And he does want to be Mr. Putin's best friend. He tells you every day that he really wants to be Mr. Putin's best friend. It's rather sad. Whereas, the worry about Mr. Zelenskyy among many of my Ukrainian friends was he's going to immediately turn our foreign policy towards Russia, et cetera, which he has not done. His response to Mr. Putin on the passport issue was extremely clear, couldn't have been clearer, and was very imaginative and intelligent. And his first visits were not to St. Petersburg and Moscow, they were to Brussels and to European capitals. So he has done things which were not exactly what at least his critics expected, right? I mean, every critic of Mr. Trump said, yes, he's going to have a lot of quiet time with Mr. Putin. True. Critics of Mr. Zelenskyy said he's going to try to move us towards Russia. That hasn't happened yet. So I think that's clearly a difference. But there's another difference, which is generations. So Mr. Trump, I don't mean this in a negative way, but he's old. And Mr. Zelenskyy is young. And this makes a huge difference because Mr. Trump's, only thought, let me put it this way, he has no reason to think about the future, and he never does. I mean, except insofar as he's thinking of a future that he doesn't end up in prison. He doesn't think of the future at all. Whereas Mr. Zelenskyy he's 41 or something. He has children, right? I mean, he thinks about the future. He has to think about the future. He's going to be living in that future. He's got decades left. They're going to be, after he stops being president, he still has decades more to live. And I mean, when Mr. Trump won, nobody who was young, or very few people who were young, thought, aha, this is an opportunity for things to change. Like, there were a lot of people who thought, yeah, like, we've showed those elites, we've showed the establishment that they don't control us. But even the people who voted for Mr. Trump, they basically thought of it as an entirely negative gesture. Like, okay, we're gonna throw a bomb, basically. And I think, of course, a lot of the people who voted for Mr. Zelenskyy were actually voting against Mr. Poroshenko. But now that he's won, I do meet young people, or I do talk to young people, who say, well, look, this is actually an opportunity. Like, now this could actually change the political system in some good way. Now Vakarchuk has to decide whether he's going to get into politics, and he's going to, which means you have two youngish, new figures in politics, right? This could actually change things. It could open things up. When Mr. Trump won, no one said, like, this could open things up. But you asked about populism. I don't think Ukraine has populism the same way. You have populists, but they actually don't win very many votes in your country. I mean, you have a completely different problem. Your problem is oligarchy. That's your problem.
You mentioned another celebrity, Slava Vakarchuk, whom you know because Slava studied in Yale when you were teaching there. And how are you also looking at this transformation from a musician to a politician? Because his party is doing well. You can already see that, yet they are not in the parliament, but he is a political player. Also, without having done anything in the politics.
I mean, it's a slightly different story. So, I mean, in the West, people are very keen to say, like, oh, like this guy's an actor and this guy's a singer. But I think they're pretty different stories. So, I mean, the case of Slava Vakarchuk, we're talking about somebody who has a PhD in physics. Like, there aren't that many PhDs in physics in national politics in Ukraine or in America or anywhere else. Like, I'm hard pressed to think of any other people who have PhDs in physics. So, I mean, this is somebody who could have been a scientist and who chose to be an artist instead. I think that matters. I mean, I think a serious scientific education in the 21st century in our world of post-truth is a big deal, a very big deal. And the second thing which is interesting about him is that he is going back to social media, he's a very responsible user of social media. Like, he has, millions and millions of followers, and he's always telling them things that are very sensible, right? He's always he's calming people down, he's showing people the other side of the story, he's telling people to reconcile, he's telling people to be nice to one another, he's pointing things out that everybody knows, but he has this kind of gentle style, which is very interesting and unusual and mature, because most people at his level use social media like either to promote themselves or to make other people angry, whereas he tends to use social media to help people get along or to learn something, but in like a nice, gentle way. And like for me, like that also is interesting about him. And the third thing which is interesting about him is that, again, a little bit unlike Zelenskyy, who didn't really talk about policy at all. Vakarchuk talks about policy all the time. Like, he's been talking about policy nonstop for the last 3 years. He went to Stanford, he went to Yale, he reads books all the time. He's constantly, he has his midlife crisis is that he's become like a policy geek. He talks about policy all the time. He's trying to figure out what to do about this or about that. And I mean, that's good, right? I think that's good. And then, I mean, so then what do I think about it? I'm happy that he started a political party because I think Ukraine needs political parties. And we've had democracy for 25 years, but the political parties are usually just, oligarchical or personal creations. Whereas with Holos, there's a chance that this could be a party which actually has something like a program, or at least like a set of standards about how to behave. That's probably a good thing. But I think it's really good that he's in politics now, because it would be bad for everybody, including Mr. Zelenskyy himself, if Mr. Zelenskyy had a parliamentary majority and can govern by himself. I mean, that would be, because he just doesn't have the experience. I mean, smart as he is, he just doesn't have the experience. He doesn't have the depth of cadres to run the whole country and to fill every ministry. He just doesn't have that many people. And also, like, if you get 73% and then you're given total responsibility for everything, you're going to crash. There's no, I mean, you need to have somebody to cooperate with, and also somebody like to share responsibility with. So I'm hopeful that, not just because it's Slavoj Vakarchuk, but I'm hopeful that if what's it called, servant of the people, if Mr. Zelensky's party is going to be new and big, there needs to be something else which is new and big at the same time, I think. It's just a balance.
Well, there was this discussion about the Europe which had lost its future. In particular mentioning that the last time the future was discussed was during the Maidan. Can you as well elaborate on that? What do you mean by this, and why it's so critical? Because it's true that we have this trouble with Europe. We just this week discussing the decision on the PASE to come Russia back, and people are really concerned. You maybe shouldn't be panicking, but still.
In the 21st century, a lot of politics is the politics of time. So a lot of what people call populism is actually this kind of artificial nostalgia. So let's imagine that the 1930s were good, or the 1940s were good, or the 1950s were good. Mr. Putin does that, Mr. Trump does that, Orban does that, Kaczynski does that, Bolsonaro does that. Like this, we're not going to talk about the present because we're not going to pretend that we're going to change the present, really. All the money, which is where it is going to stay where it is. We're not going to touch that. We're going to talk about the past, though. We're going to tell you how things were good in the past. And that, that kills democracy in the long run, because democracy is about the future. Democracy is about, we vote because we think we might actually elect politicians who can change something in the future. And if the future goes away from politics, then democracy also goes away. For Europe, the future is very important because Europe is a new thing. It's not a state, it's not an empire, it's a new thing. And so it has to have a story about where it's going because it's new. And its story has always been that it prevented bad things. So we stopped. There was a First World War, there was a Second World War, there was no Third World War because we now have the European Union. Okay, like that's sort of true, but the Europeans need to take responsibility in a different way. I think they have, we're in like the nicest neighborhood of the nicest city of the nicest part of the world. That's wonderful. But the elites of these countries have to have something besides the status quo and fear that they're going to lose it. They also need a story about where they're going. And that was why the Maidan, in particular, but also Ukrainians in general, are quite important for Europe. Yarmolenko wrote about this at the time of the Maidan, but a lot of other people have made this point. It's true. Europe needs Europeans who are thinking about the future, who are thinking like things could get a lot better, or things need to get a lot better. And that's something that Ukraine has for export a little bit. But Ukraine obviously isn't going to do it alone. The Europeans also have to stop thinking we're good because peace, but rather that we're good because enlargement because we can deal with climate change, because we can deal with monopolies, because we can deal with digital technology, right? We're good because we can deal with the future.